The Callahan house sat at the end of Maple Ridge Drive in Ferndale, a town small enough that most people knew which family drove which car and which dogs barked at the mail truck every morning. The yard was unfenced, bordered by a line of birch trees on one side and a gravel driveway on the other, with grass that stayed green even in the driest weeks of summer because Alan Callahan watered it religiously every other evening. In the summer of 1989, that yard was where the neighborhood kids congregated after dinner, chasing fireflies and arguing over whose turn it was to be it, and making up rules for games that existed nowhere except in their collective imagination. On the evening of July 12th, 3 of them were there: 10-year-old Ricky Callahan, his 8-year-old sister Jenna, and their cousin Leo Brennan, who was 9 and visiting from 2 towns over for the week. The last person to see them was Ricky's mother, Claire, who called out from the kitchen window at 7:43 p.m. to remind them they had 20 minutes before bedtime. She remembers the exact time because the oven timer went off right after, signaling that the casserole was done, and she made a mental note to bring them in at 8 sharp so they could wash up before bed. Ricky waved at her from near the birch trees, holding something in his hands that she couldn't quite make out in the fading light. By 8:15, when she stepped outside to call them in, the yard was empty. Their bikes were still leaning against the birch trees, kickstands up, handlebars turned at odd angles. The badminton net was still up, stretched between 2 metal poles they'd hammered into the ground that morning. The shuttlecock was sitting in the grass perfectly upright, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. But the 3 kids were gone. If you're someone who's ever wondered how a case can stay cold for decades and then suddenly crack open with a single piece of evidence, this is one of those stories. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into cases that took years to unravel. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And have you ever heard of a local cold case that just refused to let go? Now let's go back to that July night in 1989, when everything normal ended in the space of 32 minutes, and 3 families stepped into a nightmare that wouldn't end for more than 3 decades. Claire Callahan didn't panic immediately. Her first instinct was that the kids had wandered into the woods behind the property, something they'd been told not to do, but occasionally tried anyway when they thought no one was watching. She walked the tree line, calling their names, her voice carrying across the humid evening air that smelled like cut grass and distant charcoal grills. When she got no response, she circled the house, checked the garage where Alan kept his tools, looked inside, both cars parked in the driveway, still nothing. She went next door to the Prestons, knocked on their screen door, and asked if they'd seen the kids. Mrs. Preston, who was watching television with her husband, said no, but that she'd heard voices in the yard around 7:50, maybe a little later. Nothing unusual, just the normal sound of children playing and laughing, the kind of background noise that was so constant in summer that you stopped really hearing it. By 8:30, Claire's husband Alan was home from his shift at the plant, still wearing his work boots and smelling like machine oil and industrial soap. He'd expected to find the kids getting ready for bed. Instead, he found Claire on the back porch, gripping the railing, her voice tight when she told him the kids were missing. By 8:45, they'd called the police. The dispatcher asked the standard questions in a calm, methodical voice. Were the children known to run off? Had there been any arguments earlier in the day? Was there a custody issue with either family? Claire answered no to all of it, her hands shaking as she held the phone. The kids didn't run off. There had been no arguments. They were just there and then they weren't. The first patrol car arrived at 9:12 p.m., pulling into the driveway with its lights off because the dispatcher had told them not to alarm the neighborhood yet. Officer Dennis Granger stepped out, flashlight in hand, and asked to see the yard. Claire walked him through the space, pointing out the bikes, the badminton setup, the row of birch trees that marked the property edge. Granger was 43, a father of 2 himself, and he'd been with the Ferndale Police Department for 19 years. He'd handled runaway teenagers and lost toddlers who'd wandered into neighbors' yards, but he'd never dealt with 3 kids vanishing simultaneously without a trace. He asked if anything looked out of place. Claire hesitated, then said something she would repeat in every interview that followed. The gate to the back alley was open. It was a small wooden gate, painted white but peeling, rarely used except when Alan took the trash cans out on collection days. It led to a narrow service road running behind the houses on Maple Ridge, a rutted gravel lane that connected to the main highway less than a quarter-mile away. Alan said he was sure he'd closed it that morning when he took the trash out. He remembered because the latch was tricky and you had to lift it just right, or it wouldn't catch. Claire couldn't remember if she'd checked it during the day. She'd been in and out of the house doing laundry and making phone calls and hadn't paid attention to the back gate. Granger made a note in his pad, then radioed for backup. Within an hour, there were 6 officers combing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, shining lights into yards and garages and garden sheds. No one had seen the children leave the yard. No one had heard a car engine starting or tires on gravel. No one had noticed anything strange at all. By midnight, the search had expanded beyond Maple Ridge Drive. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined the effort, walking the tree line with flashlights and calling out the kids' names in voices that grew hoarse as the hours passed. The Ferndale Police Department set up a temporary command post in the Callahan driveway, folding tables covered with maps and clipboards and thermoses of coffee that no one really drank. Chief Ronald Vickers, a man who'd spent his entire career in this town and had never handled a missing persons case involving children, stood under the porch light with a clipboard, trying to map out a grid search for the woods. He kept glancing at the open gate, then back at the bikes leaning against the trees. Something about the scene felt staged to him, though he couldn't articulate why. The bikes were too neatly placed, lined up almost parallel to each other. The shuttlecock was sitting upright in the grass, as if someone had set it down gently rather than letting it fall from a serve. But these were small observations, easy to dismiss as coincidence, and Vickers knew better than to build a theory on a feeling. He'd seen cases collapse because investigators got attached to hunches that didn't pan out. Still, the staging bothered him. It suggested someone had taken time to arrange things, or that the kids had left voluntarily and carefully, which didn't make sense given that they'd left their bikes behind. By dawn on July 13th, search teams had covered a 2-mile radius around the Callahan property. They'd found nothing. No clothing snagged on branches, no footprints in the soft dirt near the gate, no signs of struggle or disturbance. The morning news carried the story statewide, and by noon tips were flooding the police hotline. A woman in Greymont, 30 miles south, said she'd seen 3 children matching the description getting into a white van near a gas station around 9 p.m. the night before. She couldn't provide details about the driver, except that he'd been wearing a baseball cap. Another caller reported seeing kids on bicycles on Route 9 around the same time, heading east toward the county line. A third claimed they'd heard screaming from the woods behind Maple Ridge around 8 p.m., but hadn't thought much of it, because kids were always playing there, and screaming was just part of how they communicated. Vickers assigned officers to follow up on each lead, logging them carefully and driving out to interview the witnesses in person. None of them checked out. The woman in Greymont couldn't provide a license plate or even a clear description of the van beyond white and kind of dirty. When pressed, she admitted her eyesight wasn't great, and she'd been looking through the rain-streaked window of a diner. The bicycles on Route 9 turned out to belong to a different group of kids, teenagers from the next town over who were accounted for and had nothing to do with the Callahans. The screaming in the woods was likely an owl or a fox. Officers walked the area and found no physical evidence to support the claim. The first theory to gain traction was that the children had wandered into the woods and gotten lost. It was the simplest explanation, the one that didn't require imagining something worse happening to 3 kids in a quiet town where the worst crime in recent memory had been a series of mailbox vandalism incidents the previous fall. Search and rescue teams from 3 counties were brought in, along with tracking dogs trained to follow human scent. The dogs picked up scent trails near the gate, but lost them within 50 yards, right where the service road intersected with a wider gravel path. The handlers said this suggested the children had either gotten into a vehicle at that point, or their path had been deliberately obscured, possibly by someone driving over their tracks or by the natural erosion of scent in the July heat. The woods themselves were dense but not impassable, crisscrossed with deer trails and old logging roads that local hunters used in the fall. If the kids were in there, searchers reasoned, they'd find evidence eventually. A dropped shoe, a broken branch at child height, candy wrappers, something. Ricky had been wearing a red t-shirt, Jenna a yellow sundress, and Leo denim shorts and a striped polo. Those colors should have stood out against the browns and greens of the forest. But after 4 days of combing the area, covering more than 15 square miles, they found nothing. The temperature had been in the high 80s all week, dropping only to the low 70s at night. If the children were lost and injured, they wouldn't have lasted this long without water. The theory began to feel less plausible with each passing day, and by the end of the first week, most searchers had privately accepted that they weren't looking for survivors anymore. By the end of the first week, the focus shifted. If the children hadn't wandered off on their own, then someone had taken them. The gate became the central piece of evidence, the fixed point around which every theory revolved. Alan Callahan repeated in every interview that he was certain he'd closed it that morning, which meant someone had opened it later in the day. Claire's memory was less certain. She'd been in and out of the house all day doing ordinary tasks, and couldn't swear the gate had been closed at 7:43 when she saw the kids from the window. But the implication was the same regardless. The gate led to the service road, and the service road connected to the main highway. If someone had parked on that road, away from the streetlights and the view of neighbors, they could have lured or forced the children through the gate and driven off without being seen from Maple Ridge Drive. The question was who, and why, and where they'd gone after leaving Ferndale. Investigators began building comprehensive timelines and interviewing everyone who'd been in the area that evening, including people who'd simply driven through on their way to somewhere else. A man named Gerald Pitkin, who lived 3 houses down from the Callahans, admitted he'd driven past their house around 8 p.m. on his way back from the hardware store where he'd picked up paint supplies for a bathroom renovation. He said the yard looked empty when he passed, but he couldn't be sure because it was getting dark and he was focused on the road. His alibi for the rest of the evening was solid. He'd been home with his wife painting their bathroom, and neighbors confirmed seeing his truck in the driveway until well past midnight. Another resident, a retired teacher named Lorraine Huff, who lived on the opposite end of Maple Ridge, said she'd seen a dark-colored sedan parked on the service road earlier that afternoon, around 3 p.m., but it was gone by the time she looked again around 6. She couldn't describe the driver or provide a plate number because she'd only glanced at it while walking her dog. Vickers sent officers to canvass nearby towns, showing photos of the children and asking about suspicious vehicles or strangers who'd been asking about kids. Nothing came back that felt solid. The pressure on the Callahan and Brennan families was immense and unrelenting. Claire stopped sleeping, spending her nights walking the yard and the tree line with a flashlight, as if the act of retracing her steps would somehow bring the children back or reveal something she'd missed. Alan took a leave of absence from the plant and dedicated himself to organizing volunteer searches, printing flyers at the local copy shop, and appearing on local news broadcasts to plead for information. His face became familiar to anyone who watched the evening news, drawn, exhausted, holding photos of his children and asking anyone who knew anything to come forward. Leo's parents, Karen and Jeff Brennan, drove in from their home in Collier Township the morning after the disappearance and set up in a motel near Ferndale, refusing to leave until their son was found. They'd sent Leo to stay with the Callahans for the week because he loved playing with his cousins, and they'd thought it would be a good break before school started again in the fall. Now they were trapped in a motel room, answering the same questions over and over, wondering if they'd made a terrible mistake by letting him go. The 3 families became the public face of the case, their grief and desperation broadcast across the region. Every interview ended the same way: a plea for anyone with information to come forward, and a promise that they wouldn't stop searching. But as the days turned into weeks, the leads dried up, and the searches yielded nothing. A quiet sense of dread settled over everyone involved. The children were gone, and no one knew why or how or where they'd been taken. One detail kept surfacing in interviews, small but persistent enough that investigators couldn't ignore it. Multiple neighbors mentioned that the kids had been playing with a cassette recorder earlier that day. Ricky had gotten it for his birthday a few months earlier in April. A cheap plastic model from Radio Shack with a built-in microphone and a record button that clicked satisfyingly when you pressed it. He'd been obsessed with it since the day he unwrapped it, recording himself and his friends goofing around, making up fake radio shows, interviewing his sister and cousin in exaggerated voices, then playing the tapes back and laughing at how different they sounded on the recording. On July 12th, several neighbors recalled seeing him carrying it around the yard, holding it up while Jenna and Leo performed some kind of skit or song they'd been working on. Mrs. Preston said she'd heard them from her living room, their voices coming through the recorder's tinny speaker as they played back what they'd just recorded. No one thought much of it at the time. It was just kids being kids, entertaining themselves with a toy. But when investigators searched the house and the yard after the disappearance, the recorder was gone. Claire was certain Ricky had brought it outside that evening because she'd seen him with it right before dinner. It wasn't among the items left behind in the yard. The cassette inside it, if there had been one, was missing too. Vickers noted this in the case file, but didn't assign it much weight. Kids lost things all the time. Maybe Ricky had brought it back inside earlier in the evening and put it somewhere unusual on a shelf or in a closet, and it would turn up eventually. Maybe it had been in the yard when the police arrived, and someone had accidentally picked it up during the initial chaos and confusion. It was just one more unanswered detail in a case that was rapidly filling up with them. By the end of August, the story had faded from the daily news cycle. The search teams had been called off except for a small group of volunteers who still walked the woods every weekend. The FBI had reviewed the case and found no evidence of an organized abduction ring or interstate trafficking, which meant it remained a local matter under Ferndale jurisdiction. Vickers and his team continued to follow up on tips as they came in, but the volume had dropped to a trickle. The case file grew thicker with dead ends, interviews that went nowhere, sightings that couldn't be verified when investigators drove out to check them, theories that collapsed under scrutiny when timelines didn't match or alibis checked out. The three families refused to give up, organizing anniversary vigils on July 12th and keeping the story alive in regional media whenever a reporter would listen. But as the years passed, public attention shifted elsewhere. There were other tragedies, other disappearances, other crimes that demanded attention. Ferndale returned to its routines, though the Callahan house remained a quiet reminder of what had been lost. Claire and Alan eventually moved away in 1993, unable to bear living in a place where every corner of the yard held a memory of their children. The house was sold to a young couple from out of state who knew nothing about its history. It was repainted, the yard was renovated, and new families occupied it who had no connection to what had happened there on a summer evening 4 years earlier. The case became one of those stories people in Ferndale mentioned in hushed tones, especially when someone new moved to town and asked about the history of the area. There were theories, of course, dozens of them, passed around at coffee shops and PTA meetings and late-night conversations. Some people thought the children had been taken by a drifter passing through, someone who'd seen an opportunity and acted on impulse. Others believed it was someone local, someone the kids might have recognized and trusted, which would explain why there was no sign of struggle. A few people, mostly those who'd watched too many true crime documentaries, speculated about organized trafficking rings, though there was no evidence to support that. None of the theories could be proven with the evidence available. The physical evidence was minimal: an open gate, 3 bicycles, a badminton set, and the absence of anything that pointed to a clear conclusion. Vickers retired in 1997, handing the unsolved case over to his successor with a sense of failure he never quite shook. He'd done everything by the book, followed every lead, pursued every angle, but the case had beaten him. Claire Callahan died in 2004 from complications related to pneumonia, never knowing what had happened to her children. Alan remarried in 2006 and moved to Oregon, cutting ties with Ferndale entirely and refusing to discuss the case with anyone, including the few reporters who still occasionally tried to contact him. Karen and Jeff Brennan stayed in Collier Township, keeping a small memorial for Leo in their front yard, a stone marker with his name and dates, but they stopped speaking to the media after the 10th anniversary when it became clear that talking about it wasn't bringing their son back. The case went cold, not because people stopped caring, but because there was simply nowhere left to look. Every lead had been exhausted. Every witness had been interviewed multiple times. Every possible theory had been considered, and either pursued or dismissed based on available evidence. The file sat in the Ferndale Police Department evidence room, 3 boxes of documents and photos and interview transcripts and maps, gathering dust but never quite forgotten. New detectives would occasionally pull it out, read through it during slow weeks, wonder if there was something their predecessors had missed. But the answer was always the same. There was nothing new to find. The children had vanished, and whoever had taken them had left no trace that could be followed. In 2016, the Ferndale Police Department underwent a modernization initiative, digitizing its old case files to make them searchable and to preserve records that were deteriorating in storage. The Callahan disappearance was included in this effort. A junior detective named Amelia Cross, who'd grown up in a neighboring town and heard the story as a cautionary tale in her childhood, took an interest in the file during the digitization process. She was 29, ambitious, and frustrated by the number of cold cases sitting in the department's records. She spent weeks reviewing the scanned interviews, the search reports, and the evidence logs, looking for something that might have been missed or undervalued in the original investigation. She found inconsistencies in some of the witness statements, times that didn't quite line up, descriptions of vehicles that were vague to the point of uselessness. Gerald Pitkin had said he drove past the house at 8 p.m., but his receipt from the hardware store was time-stamped at 7:52, which meant he would have had to drive straight home and past the Callahan house within 8 minutes, which was possible but tight. Lorraine Huff's description of the sedan on the service road was so generic, it could have been any of 50,000 vehicles in the region, but none of this amounted to anything actionable. Cross reached out to Alan Callahan in Oregon, sending him a carefully worded letter, asking if he'd be willing to discuss the case again, to review the timeline one more time in case he remembered any detail that hadn't seemed important back then. He declined politely but firmly in a brief phone call. He'd moved on, he said, as much as anyone could from something like that. He had a new life, a stepdaughter he was helping raise, and he didn't want to relive the worst period of his existence. Cross noted his response in her file and moved on to other cases, but she kept the Callahan file flagged in the system, a digital reminder that some questions never get answered, no matter how badly you want them to. The break came in the spring of 2023, 34 years after the children vanished, in a way no one could have predicted. A woman named Iris Copeland, who was cleaning out her late mother's house in Ferndale, found a box of old cassette tapes in the attic behind several decades' worth of Christmas decorations and forgotten luggage. Her mother, Doris Copeland, had been a long-time resident of Maple Ridge Drive, living 4 houses down from the Callahans throughout the 80s and 90s. Doris had passed away the previous winter at 87, and Iris was sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate or discard. Most of the tapes were recordings of old radio shows that Doris had liked, or family events like birthday parties and Thanksgiving dinners, labeled in Doris's careful cursive handwriting with dates and occasions. But one tape, near the bottom of the box, beneath a layer of unlabeled blanks, was different. It had no label on the spine. Instead, someone had written directly on the plastic casing in black marker, in handwriting that wasn't Doris's, "Play this." The letters were blocky and urgent-looking, and the instruction felt strange, almost ominous, though Iris couldn't explain why. She wasn't sure if she should play it or not. It could have been anything. A prank recording, something private her mother had kept for reasons Iris didn't understand. But the instruction was so direct, so emphatic, that she felt compelled to follow it. She found an old cassette player in the basement, one of those boom boxes from the 90s with a CD player on top and dual cassette decks, dusted it off, plugged it in, and slid the tape into the player. The recording was poor quality, the kind of muffled audio you'd expect from a cheap handheld recorder held too far from the source or used by someone who didn't know to speak directly into the microphone. There were voices, young voices, layered over static and the hum of background noise that sounded like wind or distant traffic. Iris turned the volume up and listened. At first it sounded like children playing, laughing, saying nonsense phrases and making up words. She heard someone counting, then laughing, then a burst of movement that made the recorder jostle. But then, about 2 minutes in, one of the voices said something that made Iris's breath catch. "Ricky, stop. You're gonna break it." The voice was high and young, frustrated in the way kids get when someone's messing with their toy. Another voice, younger and softer, chimed in. "Let Leo have a turn." Iris stopped the tape, rewound it manually, using the pencil trick she remembered from childhood, and played it again. The names were clear. Ricky. Leo. She didn't recognize them at first, but something about the context tugged at her memory. Something she'd heard a long time ago about missing kids in Ferndale. She called her older brother, who still lived in town, and asked if he remembered anything about kids named Ricky and Leo going missing years ago. He did. Everyone in Ferndale over a certain age remembered. It had been the biggest story in the town's history. Iris contacted the Ferndale Police Department first thing the next morning, explaining what she'd found. The officer who took her call was skeptical at first. They got occasional calls from people who believed they'd found evidence related to the Callahan case, and most of them turned out to be coincidences or misunderstandings or someone's well-meaning but misguided attempt to help. But when Iris mentioned the cassette and the specific names on the recording, the officer asked her to bring it in immediately. "Don't play it again," he said. "Don't touch it more than necessary. Bring it exactly as you found it." Iris drove it to the station within an hour, the tape sealed in a plastic bag she'd found in her mother's kitchen. The tape was logged into evidence, assigned a case number, and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The process took 2 weeks. The audio was cleaned up using digital software, the background noise filtered out as much as possible, and the voices isolated and enhanced. What emerged was a recording that appeared to have been made on July 12, 1989, in the early evening, based on contextual clues in the conversation and the ambient sound. The timestamp couldn't be confirmed definitively without additional evidence, but the content of the recording matched witness statements about the children playing in the yard that day. They were joking around, performing a mock radio show where Ricky pretended to be a DJ, and Jenna and Leo were guests being interviewed. They took turns with the recorder, arguing about who got to hold it, making sound effects with their mouths. The tape ran for about 12 minutes of this playful, ordinary activity, and then abruptly there was a shift in tone. But it was the final 30 seconds of the recording that changed everything and turned a 34-year-old cold case into an active investigation. After several seconds of silence, during which the recorder was apparently still running but the children had stopped talking, there was the sound of footsteps on gravel, heavy and deliberate. Then a man's voice, calm and conversational, with a slight accent that sounded rural or southern. "Hey, you kids want to see something cool?" There was a pause, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, and then Ricky's voice, curious and unguarded. "What is it?" The man said, "It's in my truck just back here. Come on, I'll show you. Won't take but a minute." There was the sound of movement, feet shuffling on grass, and then the faint creak of the gate opening. Jenna's voice, uncertain and a little quieter than before. "We're not supposed to go out there." The man again, still calm, almost friendly. "It's fine, it'll just take a second. Your mom won't even know. I'll have you back before she calls you in." More footsteps, faster now, and then the recording ended mid-sentence as if someone had pressed stop or the tape had run out of space. The audio lab confirmed the recording was consistent with a 1980s-era cassette recorder and had not been digitally altered or tampered with in any way. The magnetic signature on the tape matched the period, and there were no signs of modern editing software being used. It was real. It was from that night. And it captured the moment the 3 children were lured away from the yard. The discovery of the tape forced investigators to reconstruct the entire timeline with new precision and urgency. Amelia Cross, now a senior detective with more than a decade of experience, was assigned to lead the reopened investigation. The recording suggested the children had been lured through the gate by someone they didn't immediately recognize as a threat, someone who presented himself as non-threatening and even friendly. The man's voice was analyzed by audio forensics experts and run through databases of known offenders, compared against recordings of people interviewed during the original investigation in 1989. No immediate match came back, but the experts noted several things about the voice. It belonged to a man likely between 30 and 50 years old at the time of the recording. The slight regional accent suggested southern Ohio or northern Kentucky, possibly someone who'd grown up rural and moved around. The phrasing was important too. "In my truck" confirmed that a vehicle had been involved, and that the vehicle had likely been parked on the service road, just as investigators had theorized back in 1989. The casual, friendly tone suggested someone who was comfortable manipulating children, who knew how to present himself as safe, But knowing all of this didn't immediately reveal who the man was or where he'd taken the children. Cross went back through the original witness statements with the tape as her guide, looking for anyone who'd mentioned a truck on or near the service road on July 12th or in the days leading up to it. Lorraine Huff's statement from 1989 resurfaced as potentially significant. She'd mentioned seeing a dark-colored sedan on the service road that afternoon, but when Cross pulled the full transcript of her interview, she found something that hadn't been emphasized in the original report. Huff had also mentioned, almost as an aside near the end of the interview, that there had been a truck parked near the entrance to the service road earlier in the week, sometime between July 8th and July 11th. It had been there multiple times when she walked her dog in the evenings. A faded blue or green pickup, older model, nothing remarkable, except that she didn't recognize it, and it wasn't usually there. She'd assumed it belonged to a contractor or repairman working on one of the houses, which was common enough in summer. She hadn't thought to mention it in detail during the original investigation because it wasn't there on the evening of the disappearance, and investigators were focused on what had happened specifically on July 12th. Cross tracked Huff down to a care facility outside Ferndale. She was 91 years old now, her memory fragile in places but surprisingly sharp in others. When Cross played her a cleaned-up excerpt of the tape, the voice saying, "Hey, you kids want to see something cool?" Huff went quiet for a long moment. She said the voice sounded familiar, though she couldn't place it exactly. It reminded her of someone who'd been in the neighborhood that week, but she couldn't remember who. What she did remember clearly was the truck. It had been parked on the service road 3 or 4 times in the days before the children vanished. She remembered because it blocked part of the path she used when walking her dog, and she'd had to go around it. She described it again: faded green, maybe a Ford, with rust around the wheel wells and a dented rear bumper. It looked like a work truck, the kind contractors or maintenance people drove, with tools or equipment visible through the rear window. Cross expanded the search to vehicle registrations in the region, focusing on pickups matching the description that had been registered in Michigan or nearby states in 1989. The database returned hundreds of matches, but when she filtered for vehicles owned by men with prior records involving children, suspicious behavior, or arrests related to abduction or assault, the list narrowed significantly. Of the 43 names that came back, 6 had been living within a 50-mile radius of Ferndale in July 1989. Cross ran background checks on all 6, looking for any connection to Maple Ridge Drive or the Ferndale area. One name stood out immediately: Boyd Tillman, a traveling appliance repairman who'd worked contracts across southern Michigan and northern Ohio throughout the late 80s. Tillman had been arrested in 1991 in Kentucky for attempting to lure a child into his vehicle outside a grocery store. The charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence and witness credibility issues, but the arrest report was in the system. He died in 2005 in a single-car accident on a rural highway in Indiana, which meant he couldn't be questioned or confronted. But his work records, obtained from the appliance company he'd contracted with, showed he'd been in the Ferndale area from July 8th through July 13th, 1989, servicing refrigerators, washers, and dryers at several addresses on or near Maple Ridge Drive. Cross pulled the original canvassing reports from 1989 and found that Tillman had been briefly interviewed on July 14th, the day after the disappearance was reported, because he'd been working in the neighborhood and officers were talking to anyone who'd been in the area. According to the report, he'd told the interviewing officer that he hadn't seen anything unusual. He'd been focused on his repair jobs, going house to house, and hadn't noticed the kids in the yard or anything suspicious. The officer had noted that Tillman drove a green Ford pickup and had seemed cooperative but somewhat distant, giving short answers and not volunteering much information. No follow-up had been done because there was no reason to suspect him at the time. He was just one of dozens of people who'd been in the neighborhood that week, and he'd answered the questions asked of him. Now, with the tape and the vehicle description and his later arrest, Cross began building a profile. Tillman fit the audio analysis of the voice: age range, regional background, speech patterns. He drove a truck matching the description Huff had provided. He'd been in the Ferndale area at exactly the right time. And his pattern of behavior in 1991, attempting to lure a child with promises of something interesting, matched almost precisely the approach used on Ricky, Jenna, and Leo in 1989. The next step was determining where Tillman might have taken the children after luring them into his truck. Cross requested access to every record available on Tillman: financial records, phone logs, property deeds, employment records, arrest reports, everything the system could provide. Much of the data had been destroyed or lost over the decades, purged from databases or simply never digitized in the first place, but she found enough to piece together a picture of his life in 1989. He'd been 42 years old, divorced, living alone in a rented apartment in a town near Toledo when he wasn't on the road for work. He'd owned 2 properties over the course of his life, both purchased in the mid-80s and sold in the early 90s. One of them was a small cabin near the Indiana-Michigan border, about 90 miles from Ferndale, that he'd purchased in 1987 for $8,000 and sold in 1993 for slightly less. The property records described it as rustic, which usually meant no electricity or plumbing, situated on 3 acres of wooded land, accessible only by a dirt road. Cross obtained a warrant to search the property and assembled a forensic team. The current landowner, a retired couple who'd bought the land in 2010 and never done anything with it, gave permission to excavate. Cross and her team traveled to the site in late May 2023. The cabin was still standing, though barely. It had been abandoned for years, the roof sagging in the middle where water damage had rotted through the beams, the windows broken by weather or vandals, the door hanging off its hinges. The interior was empty except for debris and animal nests. The forensic team set up a grid around the property, using ground-penetrating radar to scan for disturbances in the soil that might indicate a burial site. They marked off areas of interest and began excavating carefully, documenting every layer of soil and every item they found. On the second day, about 30 yards from the cabin, in a depression that would have been harder to notice in 1989 when the surrounding vegetation was thicker, they found remains buried in a shallow grave beneath layers of leaves, dirt, and decomposed organic matter. The grave was approximately 4 feet deep, which was shallow enough that animals would have disturbed it eventually, but deep enough that it hadn't been visible from the surface. The remains were those of 3 individuals, small and consistent in size with children aged 8 to 10. They'd been buried together, wrapped in what appeared to have been plastic sheeting that had deteriorated over time. The forensic team excavated the remains carefully, documenting the gravesite with photographs and measurements before removing anything. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for analysis. Dental records confirmed their identities within a week: Ricky Callahan, Jenna Callahan, and Leo Brennan. Cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty due to the condition of the remains after 34 years in the ground, but the medical examiner noted there was no evidence of physical trauma that would have been visible on bone, such as fractures or cut marks. The most likely explanation, based on the location, the shallow burial, and the lack of skeletal trauma, was asphyxiation or poisoning, something that would have left no marks on bone. The children had likely died within hours of being taken, possibly even before they left Ferndale. Tillman had buried them quickly, probably the same night or early the next morning, and then returned to his normal routine. His work records showed he'd completed repair jobs in Ferndale on July 13th, the day after the disappearance, acting as if nothing had happened. The reconstruction of events, based on the tape, the physical evidence, and Tillman's known movements, was as follows. On the evening of July 12th, Tillman had parked his truck on the service road behind Maple Ridge Drive. He'd been in the neighborhood for several days doing repair work, and he'd likely observed the children playing in the yard, noted their routines, and identified them as potential targets. He'd approached them sometime between 7:50 and 8:10 p.m., using the same calm, friendly demeanor he'd employed in his later attempted abduction in Kentucky. He'd lured them through the gate by promising to show them something interesting in his truck. Ricky had been holding the cassette recorder, and at some point, either intentionally or by accident, the recorder had been left running, capturing the final moments before the children got into the truck. Once they were in the vehicle, Tillman had driven them to the cabin in Indiana, a location he knew was isolated and unlikely to be searched. He'd killed them there, likely using a method that left no obvious physical evidence, and buried them in the shallow grave. He'd kept some of their belongings, possibly including the recorder, either as trophies or simply to dispose of later. At some point, the recorder or the tape had ended up in Doris Copeland's possession. How the tape came to be in Doris Copeland's attic remained the final significant unanswered question, and Cross spent weeks trying to piece together that connection. She reviewed Doris's background, her relationship to the neighborhood, and any possible connection to Tillman. The answer came from Doris's service records. She'd had her refrigerator serviced by Tillman's company on July 10, 1989, 2 days before the disappearance. The service record, retrieved from the company's archives, confirmed that Boyd Tillman had been the technician who'd responded to her call. He'd been at her house for approximately 90 minutes, replacing a faulty compressor. It was possible that Tillman had accidentally left the recorder or the tape behind at Doris's house, perhaps setting it down while working and forgetting about it. Or another theory that Cross considered more likely based on Tillman's psychology, he'd deliberately left it there as a way to distance himself from the evidence. Offenders sometimes returned items to the community as a twisted form of power or control, knowing the evidence was there but hidden in plain sight. The exact sequence would never be known with certainty, but the tape had been in that attic for 34 years, waiting in a box beneath Christmas decorations for someone to find it and follow the simple instruction written on its case. Play this. The news of the discovery broke in early June 2023, dominating headlines across Michigan and spreading to national media. The remains were returned to the families for burial. Alan Callahan, now 73 and living in Oregon, flew back to Michigan for the funerals. He told reporters in a brief statement that knowing what had happened brought a kind of closure, though it didn't erase the decades of not knowing, the years of wondering if his children were alive somewhere, suffering or forgotten. He said he wished his ex-wife Claire had lived to see this day, to finally have an answer. Karen and Jeff Brennan held a private service for Leo, attended by family and a few close friends who'd stayed in touch over the years. They didn't speak to the media, choosing instead to grieve privately. The community of Ferndale held a memorial vigil on July 12, 2023, 34 years to the day after the children vanished, acknowledging what had been lost and what had finally been found. Hundreds of people attended, many of whom had been children themselves in 1989 and remembered playing with Ricky, Jenna, and Leo. The case was officially closed with a press conference at the Ferndale Police Department, where Chief Patterson, Vickers' successor, announced that the investigation had concluded and the children's remains had been recovered and identified. Amelia Cross filed her final report in August 2023, a comprehensive document that reconstructed the case from beginning to end. She noted in her conclusion that the case had been solvable in 1989 if certain pieces had fallen into place, if the cassette recorder had been found during the initial search, if Tillman had been pressed harder during his brief interview on July 14th, if the truck sightings had been taken more seriously and investigated more thoroughly, if someone had made the connection between his presence in the neighborhood and the disappearance. But hindsight was easy. At the time, with limited resources, dozens of leads to follow, and no physical evidence pointing in any specific direction, the investigation had done what it could with what it had. The tape had been the missing piece, the single element that could have broken the case open immediately, and it had taken 34 years and the death of an elderly woman for it to surface. Cross attached a note to the file recommending several procedural changes, that cold cases be periodically reviewed with fresh eyes, especially when new technology becomes available, that evidence be preserved and catalogued with obsessive care, because you never know what will become important decades later, and that small details like a child's toy cassette recorder never be dismissed as insignificant. Because sometimes, she wrote, the thing that cracks a case open isn't a dramatic breakthrough or a surprise confession. It's something simple, a tape in a box in an attic, marked with 2 words that turned out to be the most important instruction anyone could have followed. The Callahan house on Maple Ridge Drive still stands, though it's been renovated and expanded over the years, transformed to the point that it's unrecognizable from what it was in 1989. The birch trees are taller now, their white bark peeling in long strips. The yard smaller and more manicured, hemmed in by new fencing and professional landscaping that the current owners installed. The service road behind the houses is still there, though it's been paved and widened, lined with garages and storage sheds that didn't exist in the 80s. The gate is gone, removed when the property was sold and the yard was redesigned. Most people who live on Maple Ridge today don't know the history of the house, or if they do, they don't talk about it much. Real estate agents don't volunteer the information, and the internet has a short memory for tragedies that happened before the digital age. But every July, someone leaves flowers near the spot where the gate used to be. A small bouquet of mixed flowers leaning against the fence post, a quiet acknowledgement that 3 children once played there and never came home. The case is closed, the families have buried their dead, and the truth is known. But some things can't be fixed by knowing. Some losses are permanent, and some questions, even when answered, leave a silence that never quite fills. The yard is quiet now, just grass and trees and the distant sound of traffic, but if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the echo of children laughing, playing their last game before darkness fell.